It all began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon at Silver Pine International Airport, located just outside Portwell City. A sharply dressed man, modest in appearance but with a quiet confidence, approached Gate C-12 for his flight to Brighton, UK. He carried no designer logos, wore no flashy watch, and didn't travel with an entourage. If you passed him, you wouldn't guess he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. His name was Malcolm Raines, a deeply private billionaire who had amassed his fortune through groundbreaking innovations in software and a series of strategic tech acquisitions. Malcolm wasn't one to chase headlines or make noise. He believed in doing big things quietly. But today, his name would echo across the aviation industry in a way no one could have predicted. As passengers lined up to board, Malcolm took his place in business class. It was a routine journey, one he'd taken dozens of times before. He sat by the window, opened his tablet, and dove into reviewing financial reports for an upcoming merger. Everything was normal, until she arrived. The flight attendant assigned to his section was Tessa, a by-the-book employee who had been with Falcon Air for over 5 years. Young and assertive, Tessa prided herself on maintaining order and professionalism. But that day had tested her limits. A series of flight delays, back-to-back complaints, and a chaotic boarding process had left her on edge. As Tessa reached Malcolm's row, she delivered a common request in a tone that came off more as a command than a courtesy. "Sir, I need you to switch off your phone and set your device to airplane mode," she said briskly. Malcolm, deeply focused on the documents glowing on his screen, had missed the standard announcement. He looked up, slightly disoriented, and nodded. He reached for his device, preparing to comply, but Tessa, already worn thin from a long shift, mistook his pause for resistance. "Sir, I need you to follow instructions," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. Malcolm blinked, surprised by the sudden intensity. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, not out of ego, but simply because most people approached him with a certain level of respect. Still, he remained composed. "My apologies," he said calmly. "I didn't mean to cause a problem. It's off now." But Tessa wasn't finished. Whether it was the pressure of the day or a fleeting surge of misplaced authority, she decided this wasn't good enough. "You're not taking this seriously. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the aircraft," she said flatly. The cabin fell silent around them. Malcolm stared at her, disbelief tightening his jaw. In all his travels, in private jets, first-class lounges, and crowded terminals, no one had ever spoken to him this way. He glanced briefly at the other passengers, most of whom avoided eye contact, sensing the tension but not daring to intervene. Without a word, Malcolm picked up his leather bag, stood, and walked off the plane. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. But in his silence, a storm was forming. Standing alone in the terminal, Malcolm stared at the blinking gate sign, still processing what had just happened. There was no scene, no shouting, just a quiet injustice that cut deep, not because of pride, but because of principle. Then his phone rang. It was a private line. Only a handful of people had that number. The voice that answered was familiar, smooth, and composed, a stark contrast to the turbulence in Malcolm's chest. "Malcolm," said Isaac Delroy, his longtime attorney and strategic advisor. "I heard about what just happened. You want me to take care of this? Or do you want to handle it yourself?" There was a pause. Malcolm rarely let emotion guide his decisions. His empire was built on calm calculation and flawless execution. Every misstep in his past had become a stepping stone. But this was different. "This isn't about a refund or some empty apology," Malcolm said, his voice even but cold. "It's about setting a precedent. I want control." "Control?" Isaac echoed, unsure if he heard right. "I want the airline," Malcolm clarified. "Falcon Air. I want it in my name. Make the calls." Isaac didn't respond immediately. He knew Malcolm well enough to recognize that tone. This wasn't rash, it was real. And once Malcolm set something in motion, nothing could stop him. With that, the gears began to turn. The moment would mark the beginning of a hostile takeover that would leave the entire airline industry stunned, and Tessa Rowe with no idea what tidal wave she had just unleashed. Malcolm Raines stood in the terminal with his jaw set and his heart steady. This wasn't about inconvenience. It wasn't even about insult anymore. It was about control, about rewriting a narrative that had always underestimated men like him. "I don't want an apology, and I'm certainly not looking for compensation," Malcolm said, his voice low but resolute as he spoke into his phone. "I want the airline. I want Falcon Air under my name. Get it done." There was a short silence on the line. Isaac Delroy, his long-trusted attorney, tried to read between the lines. "You're saying the whole thing?" he asked cautiously. Malcolm gave a quiet, deliberate laugh. "Yes, Isaac, the entire company. I'm done being dismissed like I don't belong." Isaac had worked with Malcolm through dozens of complex takeovers and billion-dollar mergers. But this wasn't about business anymore. This was personal. And Isaac understood. When Malcolm made up his mind, nothing stood in his way. He got to work immediately. Calls were made, messages dispatched to key contacts in finance, law, and media. Within minutes, teams of lawyers began compiling ownership data, reviewing public filings, and identifying Falcon Air's major stakeholders. It was late in the evening, but for Malcolm's people, the night had just begun. Malcolm's earlier frustration was gone now, replaced by cold determination. He had no intention of letting that moment on the plane fade into obscurity. He wasn't looking to make a scene. He was about to make history. There would be pushback. He expected resistance from Falcon Air's board, especially from their old guard executives. But Malcolm had dealt with giants before. This wasn't his first corporate war, and he had the tools to win it. Immense capital, insider networks, and a legal team known for relentless precision. His wealth had always been his shield, but today it would be his sword. Less than an hour later, Malcolm returned to his penthouse office in Stonebrook Tower, overlooking downtown Portwell. He dropped his bag, untouched since leaving the airport, and sat down at the massive glass desk that had once been the center of his empire. But the papers piled on it, contracts, quarterly forecasts, acquisition models, meant little to him tonight. This wasn't about building value. It was about proving a point. His phone rang again. "Isaac, I've got your offers drafted," Isaac said, his voice alert and crisp. "We're initiating immediate share purchases. The funding is lined up, and we're already pushing the first batch through. We'll need to move quickly. The second this hits the media, it's going to get noisy." Malcolm stared out over the dark city skyline, its twinkling lights stretching far into the horizon. "Let it get noisy," he said. "I want the first name the CEO hears tomorrow morning to be mine. Make sure the offer leaves no room for hesitation." As Isaac confirmed and hung up, Malcolm leaned back in his chair. He wasn't thinking about the logistics anymore. His mind was somewhere else, back in that plane aisle where Tessa Rowe stood, unwavering and dismissive, assuming he was just another businessman trying to dodge a rule. She had no idea who she was talking to. By dawn, the legal team was deep into Falcon Air's structure, stock options, corporate bylaws, the board's voting dynamics. Pressure was already being applied to key investors, nudging them toward a sale. Some needed convincing, others only needed the right number. Isaac's team moved with surgical precision. The final phase was clear: acquire enough shares to initiate a hostile takeover. The window was narrow, but that had never deterred Malcolm. His entire legacy had been built on recognizing opportunity and acting without hesitation. This would be no different. As the early morning sun peeked through the skyline, Isaac called again. "It's almost done," he said. "The board's been alerted. The numbers are locked in. Now we wait for them to either cave or fight. But I don't think they're ready for what's coming." Malcolm stood and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Below him, Portwell buzzed to life, unaware that a seismic shift in the airline industry was about to erupt. "They're already behind," Malcolm said. "They just don't know it yet." He wasn't exaggerating. In just a matter of hours, the groundwork had been laid. The shares, the leverage, the legal framework, everything was in place. But one thought lingered more than any of the numbers: Tessa Rowe. She had seen him as someone to dismiss, someone beneath her authority. She hadn't recognized who he was, and that, more than anything, had lit the fire under Malcolm. It wasn't about ego, it was about visibility, respect, power. And now the world would see just how dangerous it was to underestimate Malcolm Raines. He smiled, not with joy, but with purpose. This wasn't just about buying an airline, it was about rewriting the rules. By mid-morning, the headlines exploded across news outlets and financial tickers alike. Mystery tycoon makes hostile bid for Falconair after airport incident. The story was everywhere. The confrontation between a flight attendant and an unknown passenger had become national news. And that passenger, it turned out, was none other than Malcolm Raines, a billionaire with a reputation for swift, strategic power plays. He wasn't looking for attention. He didn't care about interviews or speculation. As the media tried to piece the story together, Malcolm was already several steps ahead. While news anchors discussed the mysterious billionaire, his legal team was making direct contact with Falconair's board of directors. The message was simple. Malcolm's offer was non-negotiable. It was generous, immediate, and carried enough pressure to leave the board scrambling. There was no time to prepare. He had moved too quickly, too decisively. Inside Falconair's sleek glass headquarters in Eastbridge, chaos was setting in. The executive boardroom buzzed with tension as news of Malcolm's bid made its way through the ranks. At the head of the table sat Richard Callaway, Falconair's CEO. A seasoned leader, Callaway had steered the airline through economic downturns, PR disasters, and turbulent markets. But nothing had prepared him for this. "Who is this man?" Callaway asked, staring at the screen showing real-time fluctuations in the company's stock. How did we not see this coming? Executives exchanged uneasy glances. Malcolm Raines had seemed like just another passenger when he boarded that flight yesterday. No one, not even Callaway himself, had paid him a second glance. But now, he was poised to own the company they had spent decades building. The team began calling in legal experts, desperate to find a way to block the acquisition. But as they sifted through the filings, they found that Malcolm had done his homework. The shares he had acquired were locked in, protected by airtight legal terms. The takeover was not just real, it was practically inevitable. Back in his high-rise office at Stonebrook Tower, Malcolm watched the drama unfold. He sat at his polished black desk, his demeanor calm, his mind sharp. Multiple screens displayed the headlines, the legal filings, and live updates from his legal and financial teams. But he wasn't nervous. This was exactly how he'd planned it. He knew there would be pushback. He welcomed it. This wasn't just about corporate strategy. It was about making a statement, a public declaration that no one, not a company, not a CEO, and certainly not a flight attendant like Tessa Rowe, could treat him like he didn't belong. She had seen him as just another passenger. But Malcolm had become something else entirely, a reminder that the smallest insult can awaken the most powerful response. As negotiations escalated, Malcolm remained patient. His mind was already looking beyond the deal, to the impact, to the legacy. This wasn't just a business move, it was personal. And soon the entire world would understand that. The final piece of the puzzle came just before noon. Malcolm's phone rang. Isaac's voice came through the line, steady and composed, but with a hint of excitement beneath the surface. "It's done," Isaac said. "The board signed off on the acquisition. Falconair is officially yours." Malcolm exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He had expected this, but hearing the words out loud made it real. The airline that had tried to humiliate him now belonged to him. He stood from his chair, the city sprawling beneath him, and for a brief moment allowed himself to feel it, the cold satisfaction of total victory. "Good," he said. "Now send the press release." "I want the world to know who owns Falcon Air." Isaac hesitated for a second. "You sure about that?" "The press is already buzzing. If we release the statement, you'll be making front pages everywhere. It's going to stir the pot." Malcolm's lips curled into a smile, not a smile of joy, but of resolve. Let it stir. Let them speculate. This isn't just about owning an airline. It's about making sure no one ever forgets my name. Isaac didn't ask further questions. He knew Malcolm well enough to understand that once his mind was made, there was no turning back. As the call ended, Malcolm walked toward the window and looked down at the world below. It was a view he had earned. Every building, every deal, every late night and risk taken had led to this. The incident on the plane had been small, fleeting, a blip in time. But he had turned it into a storm, and this storm was far from over. Within hours of finalizing the acquisition, Malcolm Raines's name was on every screen, every ticker, and every news feed around the globe. Billionaire Malcolm Raines acquires Falcon Air following onboard incident. The headline blazed across major outlets. Some framed it as the ultimate power move. Others called it corporate revenge at its finest. But no matter how they spun it, the facts were the same. Malcolm had turned a moment of disrespect into a billion-dollar takeover. Footage of the confrontation on the plane played side by side with clips of Malcolm standing calmly outside Falcon Air's East Bridge headquarters, hands in his pockets, flanked by a wall of press. He didn't speak to reporters, didn't make a show of his triumph, but his presence said everything. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a symbol, a reminder that even a small act of disrespect, when directed at the wrong man, could change the course of an entire industry. But Malcolm wasn't finished. Later that evening, as night fell over East Bridge, he stepped into the towering headquarters of Falcon Air for the first time as its new owner. His shoes echoed through the sleek marble halls as he made his way toward the boardroom where the remaining executives, including CEO Richard Calloway, were waiting for an emergency meeting. They weren't expecting him. Not yet. Certainly not tonight. The tension was thick when Malcolm entered the room. No fanfare. No entourage. Just him, dressed in a charcoal suit, every move deliberate and unshaken. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting clean through the air, "I trust we can begin." The room fell silent. "I'm Malcolm Raines," he continued, walking slowly to the head of the table. "As of this morning, I own Falcon Air, and I'm here to make a few changes." Several executives shifted nervously. Calloway, clearly unsettled, stood awkwardly and extended his hand. "Mr. Raines, we weren't expecting you so soon. Of course, we'll do everything we can to ensure a smooth transition." Malcolm didn't take the handshake. "I'm not here for smooth," he replied. "I'm here for control. I didn't buy this company to keep it running the same way. I bought it because it disrespected me. And now everyone in this room is going to understand exactly what that means." The weight of his words dropped like a stone. Malcolm didn't shout. He didn't need to. The message had landed with devastating clarity. Calloway, for all his years in leadership, had never been on the receiving end of such cold, measured intensity. He nodded stiffly, but Malcolm could see it in his eyes. He still didn't fully understand what had happened. Malcolm turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I expect everyone to do their jobs until the end of the week," he said. "After that, we'll be discussing new leadership. Thoroughly." And just like that, he walked out, leaving the room stunned, silent, and unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Outside, the press was waiting, just as Malcolm knew they would be. Microphones were thrust in his face. Reporters shouted over one another. But Malcolm said nothing. He offered only a glance at the flashing cameras before slipping into the back seat of a waiting car. As they pulled away from the building, he allowed himself the faintest smile. Tessa Rowe, the flight attendant who had kicked him off the plane, might not know it yet. But this day, this headline, would follow her forever. In the days that followed, Malcolm became the name on everyone's lips. News programs dissected his every move. Financial analysts scrambled to understand how he had executed the takeover so quickly. Social media flooded with commentary, some praising him, others criticizing his ruthlessness. But none of it mattered to Malcolm. He didn't seek praise. He didn't need vindication. What he wanted, control, respect, power, he now had. Meanwhile, inside Falcon Air's corporate offices, the atmosphere was one of chaos barely contained. Executives were working overtime, trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage of the hostile takeover. Calloway, along with the rest of the senior team, scrambled to maintain appearances while privately preparing for the inevitable shakeup. They had been blindsided, and now they were just waiting to see who would still have a seat at the table when the dust settled. Malcolm, meanwhile, was operating at full speed. On the third day after acquiring Falcon Air, he summoned the entire leadership team for their first official meeting under his authority. The conference room was packed. Familiar faces, some loyal, many skeptical, others downright nervous. Malcolm entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. He took his place at the head of the table and waited for the murmurs to die down. "I know most of you have questions," he began, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "So let me be clear up front." He looked around the table, locking eyes with several department heads. "This airline will not be run the way it has been. It will not operate on outdated systems, ineffective leadership, or a culture of entitlement. Falcon Air is going to be efficient. It's going to be profitable. And above all else, it's going to respect people, from the baggage handlers to the business class passengers." The room was still. No one dared interrupt. "I've heard the complaints," Malcolm continued, "about how employees are treated, about how customers are ignored. That ends now. We're not going to be just another airline. We're going to be the airline people choose, because we listen, because we act, because we lead." He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "If any of you believe that's asking too much, now's the time to leave. I won't hold it against you. But if you stay, you work. No excuses, no coasting, no hiding behind corporate titles." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. For the first time in a long time, Falcon Air's leaders weren't in control. And they knew it. The air in the room was heavy as Malcolm Raines paused, letting his words settle in like thunder after a storm. "I've heard the complaints," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "That this company overworks its people, that passengers are treated like afterthoughts, that the culture here favors status quo over progress." He took a slow step forward, his gaze circling the room. "That ends today. Silence. You may not like my methods. You may think they're extreme. But we are going to become the airline people choose, not because we're cheap, not because we're convenient, but because we care, because we lead, because we respect every single person who steps on one of our planes." Then came the line that hit the room like a dropped anchor. "If any of you believe that's too much to ask, I suggest you start updating your resumes." The executives exchanged stiff glances, some shifting in their seats, others avoiding his eyes. Richard Calloway, the now wounded CEO, kept his hands folded tightly on the table, jaw clenched but silent. Malcolm had made his mark, and everyone knew it. He wasn't interested in handshakes or hollow nods. This was his company now, and things were going to change fast. Over the next hour, he laid out a series of aggressive reforms, streamlining bloated processes, cutting unnecessary costs, revamping customer service training from the ground up. But the boldest change of all? A full restructuring of the management team. Malcolm wasn't afraid to make enemies. The executives who had allowed Falcon Air to rot from the inside, who had coasted, deflected, or buried complaints, were on borrowed time. The culture of complacency was dead. When the meeting finally ended, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. The once powerful leaders of Falcon Air walked out slower, quieter, their confidence visibly rattled. Heads hung. Words were few. But Malcolm wasn't fazed by their discomfort. He had delivered the message loud and clear. He was in charge now, and this wasn't a courtesy visit. Still, one person lingered in the back of his mind, the one who had unknowingly triggered it all. Tessa Rowe. He'd thought about her more than he expected. At first, it was just irritation, a lingering memory of her voice, her dismissive tone, the way she'd looked down at him as if he were just another passenger in a cheap seat. But as time passed, he realized it was more than that. She had become a symbol, not just of the moment he was humiliated, but of every time someone had looked at him and assumed he didn't belong. Every boardroom he had to walk into twice as sharp. Every deal he had to fight twice as hard for. Tessa had reminded him, intentionally or not, that no amount of money or polish could shield him from being underestimated, and that was something Malcolm Raines could never let go. Still, he didn't know exactly what to do about her. Not yet, but he knew she wouldn't walk away untouched. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he needed the world to understand the cost of underestimating him. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his office, papers scattered across the desk. Not contracts this time, but internal memos, performance reviews, and the finalized version of Falcon Air's new leadership charter, a document that would redefine how the airline operated at every level. Outside, the buzz around his acquisition had already begun to fade from the headlines. But Malcolm didn't care. This was never about a headline. This was about long-term change, the start of something much larger. His eyes drifted toward the window as the Portwell skyline twinkled in the dusk. The city was always alive, always moving. And so was he. More acquisitions were on the horizon, more expansions, more influence. But no matter how far he looked into the future, his mind kept circling back to that moment on the plane, that quiet, calculated insult, that spark that had ignited an empire. Tessa Rowe. She still didn't know how much her actions had altered the course of her own life. But Malcolm was going to make sure she never forgot. Over the following days, Falcon Air began to transform. Slowly at first, then with breathtaking speed. The stale, top-heavy hierarchy that had once ruled the company was dismantled layer by layer. Decision-making became faster. Processes were cleaned up, meetings became shorter and more direct. Results were demanded, and people responded. Some employees were nervous, afraid of what this new chapter meant, but many others were energized. They could feel the shift. They could see that things were changing in real time. For the first time in years, the company wasn't drifting. It was flying. And at the center of it all was Malcolm Raines, relentless, focused, tireless in his pursuit of a company that reflected his values: excellence, efficiency, and respect. Every week he met with department heads. He demanded progress. He tolerated no delays, no excuses. Anyone falling short was quietly replaced. He had no tolerance for mediocrity, and the results spoke for themselves. Within weeks, Falcon Air's stock price began to climb. Customer feedback surveys showed steady improvement. Even the staff at terminals, once sullen and slow-moving, seemed more alive, knowing now that someone at the top actually meant business. But even in the midst of his success, one thing remained unresolved. Tessa. He hadn't forgotten her. He couldn't. That single moment, one woman's decision to dismiss him, had triggered the most aggressive corporate transformation of his life. To her, he had just been an inconvenience. To him, she had become the match that lit a fire under his legacy. And Malcolm Raines was not about to let her name fade into history without consequence. Tessa Rowe had once believed she could speak down to Malcolm Raines, that she could scold him, embarrass him, and then walk away as if nothing had happened. But now the landscape had shifted entirely. Malcolm wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was in charge of her world, her airline, her employer, her entire future. And while many would have acted in anger, He wasn't that kind of man. Malcolm believed in timing. He believed in precision. Time, he had learned long ago, was his most powerful ally. As Falcon Air's new owner, Malcolm had the perfect stage. With every passing day, his influence grew, not just over the company's bottom line, but over the culture, the tone, and the power structure. He wasn't just reshaping a business, he was shaping a legacy. And he intended for everyone to learn a lesson from it. But he wouldn't go after Tessa blindly. No, this had to be calculated, a lesson that would resonate not just with her, but with anyone watching. A quiet message that would echo across departments and boardrooms alike. Underestimate me, and you will regret it. So he started gathering information. Nothing obvious, nothing aggressive, just details. His internal team, trained to operate quietly and thoroughly, began building a full picture of Tessa Rowe's time at Falcon Air, where she'd worked before, how she got here, her record, her relationships with colleagues, her past incidents with passengers. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. Tessa had begun her career at a small regional carrier, climbing quickly with dreams of reaching international routes. She was ambitious, sharp, confident, and often praised for her strict adherence to the rules. But that same rigidity, it seemed, had also caused friction. Passengers had filed complaints. Several noted her tone as condescending, her manner as overly assertive. Her colleagues described her as competent but difficult, a perfectionist who sometimes mistook control for leadership. To most companies, these would be minor issues, small cracks in an otherwise decent record. But to Malcolm, they were entry points. He wasn't going to fire her on the spot. That would be too easy, too expected. Instead, he devised a plan, one that would force Tessa to come face to face with the power she once dismissed, a plan that would unfold slowly, publicly, and with devastating clarity. First, he instructed Falcon Air's HR division to quietly flag her file. Every review, every complaint, every memo, every skipped step she might have taken, every overly harsh exchange, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough to build a case, one that would be airtight if ever challenged. Then he waited. Malcolm believed in the long game. He knew that the most powerful moves were the ones made in silence, and executed when no one expected them. Days passed. Falcon Air continued its transformation under Malcolm's leadership. Meetings became leaner. Departments became sharper. The pace quickened. Morale, despite the pressure, began to rise among employees who welcomed change. But behind the scenes, Malcolm's eye remained fixed on one name: Tessa Rowe. He tracked her flight schedules discreetly, monitored her routes, never close enough to raise suspicion, just close enough to stay ready. He didn't want her to feel watched. He didn't need her to. What he wanted was the moment. And then, one morning, that moment arrived. After a quick lunch meeting with one of Falcon Air's financial advisors, Malcolm returned to his office and was met by his executive assistant. "Mr. Raines," she said, "you might want to see this." She handed him a printed memo from operations. Tessa Rowe had been assigned to a high-profile international flight, one that would be under extra scrutiny, attended by VIP passengers and senior observers. It wasn't just any route, it was a flagship flight, part of a media campaign Falcon Air was rolling out to showcase its new direction under Malcolm's ownership. It was perfect, a stage, an audience. And the woman who had once dismissed him, now set to serve the very airline she had once kicked him off of, unaware that its owner had been watching her ever since. Malcolm read the memo once, then again. He didn't smile. He didn't react. He simply picked up the phone and said 3 words to his operations chief: "Make it happen." The flight was no ordinary one. It was one of Falcon Air's most publicized international routes, the kind of high-profile journey attended by elite clients, media figures, and industry watchers. Cameras, scrutiny, and expectations would all be on board. Malcolm Raines had waited for the perfect moment, And now it had arrived. This flight wasn't just a scheduled trip. It was a stage. And Tessa Rowe, the flight attendant who had once dismissed him like a nobody, was about to find herself under a spotlight she'd never asked for. Malcolm made the call. To his head of operations, he gave one order: place PR on that flight. Full team. Quiet, but ready. His security team received similar instructions. Keep things subtle. Present. Ready to act, but invisible. Just in case. He didn't want a scene. He wanted a statement. That evening, as travelers streamed into Portwell International Terminal, Malcolm entered quietly through a private security gate. Even in the bustling energy of the terminal, his presence was magnetic. He didn't need to announce himself. People moved aside instinctively. Power, after all, rarely needs to be loud. He spotted her instantly. Tessa stood by the crew check-in desk, mid-conversation with another flight attendant. Her voice was tight, her hands gesturing in frustration. Something about the flight schedule had changed at the last minute, and she wasn't happy. Perfect, Malcolm thought. He watched for a moment, letting her frustration build, then began walking calmly across the terminal. Tessa turned and froze. Their eyes locked. For a second, her breath caught in her chest. She masked it quickly, squaring her shoulders, forcing a smile. But Malcolm could see the flicker of panic beneath her professional exterior. "Mr. Rains," she greeted, her voice strained. "Is there something I can help you with?" He didn't smile. He didn't return the greeting. He simply stepped closer and locked eyes with her, his tone low and cold. "There's something we need to discuss, Tessa." She blinked. Of course." "I've reviewed your conduct during our last encounter," he said slowly, "and I want to make something clear. I do not tolerate disrespect, especially not from someone who represents my company." Her face paled. The tension in her shoulders was now unmistakable, but she didn't flinch. "Not yet." "I didn't mean—" she started, but he cut her off with a single raised finger. "You made a choice," he said, his voice sharper now. "You assumed authority that wasn't yours. You acted not just against me, but against the values this company now stands for, and that's a mistake you won't get the chance to make again." The crew members standing nearby had all gone silent, drifting just out of earshot, but clearly watching. The air around them thickened, the kind of silence that comes before a seismic shift. Malcolm stepped closer. "I've already spoken to HR," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties with Falcon Air." Tessa's eyes widened. Her pride battled visibly with the rising flush of embarrassment. She didn't speak. Couldn't. She knew, just as Malcolm did, that this wasn't an ordinary termination. This was a message. "You will not be made into a public example," he added, voice steady. "But understand this. Your behavior wasn't a blip. It was a statement, and now this is mine." There was nothing left to say. She stood frozen in place, humiliated, while Malcolm turned and walked away. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with purpose. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The story had already begun spreading through the terminal before he reached the exit. Within hours, whispers turned to headlines. Falcon Air flight attendant dismissed by CEO moments before takeoff fallout continues as Malcolm Rains enforces new era of accountability. Social media exploded. Anonymous employees, frequent flyers, and corporate insiders all weighed in. Some praised the swift justice. Others speculated about the backstory. But everyone agreed on one thing. Malcolm Rains had just drawn a line in the sand, and he had done it publicly, decisively, and without hesitation. In the days that followed, the story of Tessa's firing became a flashpoint across the industry. Editorials debated the ethics. Industry panels called it a masterclass in leadership optics. Other airlines quietly reviewed their own flight crew policies, realizing that Falcon Air was setting a new standard. But for Malcolm, it wasn't about news cycles. It was about ensuring that no one would ever forget the lesson. Tessa Rowe had thought she could embarrass him. And now? He had taken everything she valued, her position, her image, her control. He didn't need revenge. He needed clarity. And now the world had it. The media storm that followed Tessa Rowe's removal rippled far beyond Falcon Air's gates. Passengers from the flight began sharing their own accounts online, snippets of the confrontation, shocked reactions, hushed crew chatter. Some called Malcolm Raines ruthless, others called him a visionary. But no one, not even his fiercest critics, could deny one truth: Malcolm had made his point. And that point was simple. Never underestimate him. For Malcolm, it was never about revenge. It was about precedent, a warning to anyone in his orbit that dismissing him, challenging him, or treating him as less than came with consequences. As the media cycle eventually moved on, Malcolm didn't. While the world speculated about what he might do next, he remained focused on one thing: cementing Falcon Air's transformation. Behind closed doors, the executives who had once questioned his leadership were beginning to fall in line. The doubters had grown quiet. The fence-sitters had started to choose sides. Even the board, which had once privately feared his aggression, now saw the results. Stock prices continued to climb. Customer satisfaction ticked upward. Operational delays dropped to their lowest level in 5 years. The skeptics were running out of arguments, but Malcolm wasn't interested in gloating. He had no use for pats on the back. He understood one thing better than most: power fades fast if you don't keep evolving. So, to keep the pressure and the focus sharp, he called for a company-wide summit, a moment not just to recap wins, but to redefine the standard. Everyone who mattered was invited: top executives, regional managers, division heads, senior pilots, ground crew chiefs, even legacy hires brought in by the previous administration. The message was clear: show up, listen, or step aside. On the day of the meeting, the Grand Conference Hall at Falcon Air's Eastbridge headquarters buzzed with low chatter. Tension filled the air like fog before a storm. Some were hopeful, some were nervous, all were curious. What was Malcolm going to do next? And then the doors opened. Malcolm Raines walked in without an entourage. No dramatic entrance, no music, just presence. And that alone was enough to command the room. He took the stage and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Calm, composed, unshaken. "Good morning," he began. His voice was even, steady, the kind of voice that made people sit straighter without realizing. "I don't need to tell you how far we've come in the past few weeks," he continued. "You've seen the numbers, the shift, the momentum." He paused, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "But I'm not here to talk about numbers. I'm here to talk about standards." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Malcolm raised a hand and continued. "When I acquired Falcon Air, it wasn't just for the jets, or the routes, or the stock. It was because I saw something in this company no one else did. Untapped potential. But potential means nothing without commitment, without discipline, without integrity." He let that land before stepping forward slightly, his eyes scanning the room. "This company will be built on 3 things: respect, accountability, and hard work. If you're not prepared to live by those values, you won't last here. That's not a threat, that's a promise." Around the room, heads nodded, some slow, some stiff. Others just stared, knowing this wasn't just another corporate pep talk. This was a declaration. "We are no longer a company that tolerates mediocrity," Malcolm continued. "We will not make excuses for poor service. We will not allow leaders to coast in cushy roles. We will not let passengers walk away feeling ignored or dismissed." He locked eyes with a row of executives near the back. "If you think the expectations are too high, if you think excellence is too much to ask, then I suggest you start looking for your next opportunity." The room went dead silent. Malcolm took his time. "I've already started a review of the entire leadership team. Some of you will be offered new roles. Others will be offered the chance to leave quietly. You've had your chance. He stepped back, folded his hands behind his back. I'm not here to run this company like it's been run before. I'm here to make Falcon Air the most respected name in the sky. That means pushing harder, thinking bigger, and never settling. And then his voice dropped slightly, firmer, colder, and one last thing. He looked out again, the edge in his voice unmistakable. I don't want to hear another story, not one, about employees being disrespected by those in power. This isn't just a company that values results. We value people. Anyone in the room who had dismissed Tessa's firing as an act of ego now understood differently. This wasn't about ego. It was about setting the tone. As Malcolm stepped away from the podium, the room remained quiet. Not from fear, but from understanding. There was a new era at Falcon Air, and it bore Malcolm Raines' name. As the final echoes of his company-wide address faded and Falcon Air's staff returned to their stations, one truth remained undeniable. Malcolm Raines had changed everything. No one left that meeting untouched. Some were inspired, others were shaken. But all understood that the man now leading Falcon Air was not a figurehead. He wasn't here to preserve the old ways or entertain negotiations. Malcolm's authority was total, and growing stronger by the day. He had reshaped not just an airline, but the culture itself. In the weeks that followed, results began to speak louder than the headlines. Productivity surged. Customer satisfaction hit record highs. Even the most cynical employees began to recognize that something rare was happening, a genuine transformation fueled by purpose, not politics. But despite his outward composure, Malcolm's mind remained tethered to one unfinished thread: Tessa Rowe. Her dismissal had been swift and public. The statement had been made, but it didn't feel complete. She wasn't just a disgruntled employee. She was the spark, the catalyst, the woman who had triggered a multi-billion-dollar empire shift with one bad decision. Her name, her face, her moment of defiance, it was all etched into Malcolm's memory like a scar. And that scar wasn't fading. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about narrative, legacy, ensuring that what happened wouldn't be lost in the churn of news cycles or reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in break rooms. No, Malcolm wanted permanence. He wanted her name tied to his, in history and in consequence. So he acted. With a single call, he activated Falcon Air's in-house PR division, instructing them to dig into every corner of Tessa's post-termination life. Job applications, public profiles, statements made online. He wanted to know where she was applying, who she was talking to, and how she was being perceived. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. She was struggling. Her name had already become a red flag within the industry. Hiring managers whispered behind closed doors about the Rowe incident. Recruiters hesitated. Word had spread that she had disrespected Malcolm Raines and been fired for it. But Malcolm wasn't satisfied with quiet hesitations. He wanted a wall, something permanent, something absolute, a career that wasn't just damaged, but ended. So he took it to the next level. He called in his legal team. I want her blacklisted, Malcolm said calmly. Not in a way that invites lawsuits, in a way that protects us, protects the brand. We build the narrative, we control the story. His lawyers understood. Discretion and precision, the Malcolm Raines way. Within hours, they began circulating a confidential briefing to key HR directors and aviation decision-makers across the industry. Not press releases, private calls, sealed letters, and carefully worded internal memos. The message was always the same. Tessa Rowe had violated professional conduct. She had undermined leadership. She had exhibited a pattern of disregard for chain of command and passenger interaction. Was she dangerous? No. Was she reckless? Possibly. Was she worth the risk? Absolutely not. To further seal the narrative, Malcolm's PR advisors began crafting a subtle media campaign. They didn't mention her by name, but they didn't have to. Industry articles began to surface. Why companies are rethinking their frontline protocols. The rising cost of rogue employees in customer-facing roles. Each article nudged public perception a little further from sympathy and closer to consensus. Tessa Rowe wasn't a wronged employee. She was a liability. Back at Falcon Air, Malcolm made sure to stay in the spotlight, not for personal glory, but to keep his narrative front and center. He appeared at press events, spoke on leadership panels, gave calm, articulate interviews about corporate values, discipline, and what it meant to protect a brand in a volatile world. And each time he did, he reinforced one simple truth. There's a new standard now, and I set it. The spotlight followed Malcolm Raines wherever he went. Industry conferences, press events, board meetings. Each time he stepped behind a microphone, every word he spoke carried weight. Not because he raised his voice, but because everyone listening knew he didn't speak unless he meant every syllable. His vision was no longer just internal policy. It was the new gold standard. As his airline, Falcon Air, soared under his command, Malcolm never wasted a moment. He remained relentlessly visible, crafting the image of a leader who didn't just inherit power, but earned it, seized it, and wielded it like a sword. Behind the scenes, his legal and PR teams continued their quiet campaign. Tessa Rowe's name had become synonymous with one thing: a cautionary tale. Industry insiders had received the memo. Job offers dried up. Recruiters ghosted her. And finally, a quiet but chilling announcement was passed through private HR circles and internal forums. Former flight attendant Tessa Rowe has been permanently removed from consideration across major airlines due to repeated conduct violations during her employment with Falcon Air. There was no press release, no official comment, but it didn't need one. The message had landed, and it stuck. No one wanted to risk hiring the woman who had publicly crossed Malcolm Raines, not after seeing what happened next. While Tessa faded into professional obscurity, Malcolm's empire thrived. The restructuring at Falcon Air was complete. Operational efficiency reached historic highs. Morale, once shaky, found solid footing among those who survived the upheaval. Stock prices continued to climb. Shareholders celebrated. Customers returned. Malcolm had taken a moment of insult, a single act of dismissal, and turned it into a billion-dollar redefinition of what leadership could look like in the aviation world. He sat one afternoon in his Eastbridge office, reviewing quarterly reports with the faintest smile. Everything he had envisioned was unfolding with precise symmetry. The airline was his. The industry respected him. And the woman who had disrespected him was now a name no one dared associate with. It should have been enough. But Malcolm didn't believe in enough. He believed in expansion. His team had already flagged a promising opportunity, a smaller upstart airline making noise in the regional market. Fresh branding, loyal clientele, innovative tech systems. The only problem? They didn't have the resources to grow. Malcolm didn't see that as a problem. He saw it as a perfect acquisition target. And like every other move he made, he acted swiftly. No drawn-out negotiations. No public teasers. He approached the regional airlines board with an offer that silenced the room. Full acquisition, above market valuation, immediate integration. Resistance was brief. Loyalty, after all, has a price. Within 3 weeks, the deal was closed. The press barely had time to prepare their headlines before the story hit. Falcon Air acquires Skybridge Regional in bold expansion move industry. Insiders were stunned. Malcolm Raines had done it again, growing his empire in record time and adding new territory to Falcon Air's reach. But the acquisition wasn't just about growth. It was about control. Malcolm immediately brought in his trusted circle of executives, the same ones who had helped turn Falcon Air around. The integration began swiftly, and to some, ruthlessly. Policies were overhauled, Redundant roles were eliminated. Leadership structures were replaced. Resistance flared in some departments. It didn't last. Malcolm's reputation preceded him. Adapt or be left behind. That was the unspoken reality. There were power struggles, of course, debates about how to merge cultures, disagreements about branding, clashes over operational priorities. But Malcolm, ever the strategist, welcomed it all. This was how strong companies were built, and he built them fast. Within 3 months, the newly combined airline operation was showing results. Faster turnaround times, expanded routes, stronger profit margins. Stockholders once again leaned in, eager to invest in whatever Malcolm Raines touched. The market responded. Falcon Air's valuation hit an all-time high. Investors praised the clarity of his vision. Competitors scrambled to mimic his model. And even CEOs outside of aviation began citing Malcolm's transformation as a business case study. And yet, despite all the accolades, all the data, all the noise, Malcolm remained focused. He knew his ascent had started with a spark. One moment of disrespect, one flight, one name. Tessa Rowe. She had tried to put him in his place. She had seen a man in business class and treated him like any other traveler, not knowing who he was or what he was capable of. Now she was a footnote, and he was a force. But Malcolm didn't smile because of her downfall. He smiled because of what it had taught him. In a world that often underestimated people like him, quiet, composed, unflashy, he had learned to strike when no one was watching. And now? The world never took its eyes off him. Even with the endless accolades and headlines declaring Falcon Air as the new face of aviation, Malcolm Raines couldn't shake a growing weight from his chest. He had won. The acquisition was flawless. The restructuring was complete. The market couldn't get enough of him. And Tessa Rowe? She was nothing more than a memory, or so he kept telling himself. But there was something about how it all ended that still didn't sit right. Malcolm had made her a lesson, a warning stitched into the fabric of an entire industry. He'd ensured her blacklist stayed permanent, looping in contacts across every major airline, private jet service, and charter firm. Her applications were flagged. Conversations ended before they began. Her reputation had been torched with chilling efficiency. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about her. It was a rainy Thursday when Malcolm sat at his desk in Eastbridge Tower, a glass of single malt in hand, the city skyline blurred behind streaks of water. The latest financials were spread across his desk. All excellent. The company was thriving, soaring higher than ever. Still, that name echoed like a whisper in the back of his mind. Tessa Rowe. She had underestimated him, treated him like an ordinary man, humiliated him on a flight, not knowing she was speaking to the very person who would soon own the sky she worked in. It should have ended with her firing, but it hadn't, because she had started it all. And now, as Malcolm considered his next move, a darker idea crept into his thoughts. What if her downfall wasn't just the start of his rise, but the symbol of it? What if he didn't just bury her professionally? What if he ensured that no one could ever mention his story without mentioning hers? He leaned back in his chair, watching the ice swirl in his glass. This wasn't about bitterness anymore. It was about narrative, legacy, control. He picked up the phone. "Get me Morgan in legal," he said calmly. Within the hour, his core team was back on the line. PR, legal, strategy. "I want to reinforce the blacklist." "Make it airtight," Malcolm instructed. "No lateral moves, no rebrands, no hidden hires under contractors. Her name doesn't make it through any door in aviation." Morgan hesitated. "Already done that, sir. She's a ghost in this industry." "Not enough," Malcolm replied. "Make her a ghost in the conversation. That was step 1. Step 2, go public, but not obviously." He began pushing a quiet campaign through his extensive media network. Trade publications, LinkedIn think pieces, corporate panels, all focused on the growing importance of accountability in frontline aviation roles. Articles began appearing with titles like "The Cost of Defiance in High-Stakes Environments." When one employee's judgment sparks a multi-million-dollar shift, the stories were subtle, but they always circled back to the same parable: a young flight attendant who had crossed the wrong line and paid the price. Her name was never hidden. Tessa, once just another uniform, now a myth wrapped in failure. Across social media, anonymous users began referencing her story, half in whispers, half in warning. Employers used her name as a reference point in interviews. "We don't want another Roe situation," some would say. Malcolm had done it. He had ensured that her name wouldn't just vanish. It would forever live in infamy. And for a while, that was enough. But as the months passed and the empire grew larger, the adrenaline that once fueled him began to slow. He watched as Falcon Air absorbed Skybridge Regional and began expanding into South American and European markets. New contracts rolled in. A third terminal was approved in Eastbridge. His name continued to headline the industry's biggest conversations. He had become untouchable. And yet, something gnawed at him. A hollow feeling, a strange absence of satisfaction. He had done everything he set out to do, built the most powerful airline brand in the Western Hemisphere, commanded the press, won the admiration of investors, crushed his critics. And still, in the stillness of the evening, he found himself staring out the glass walls of his office, asking himself a question he didn't know how to answer. Was it enough? Was Tessa's fall really the victory he thought it was? Or was it just the spark that reminded him how deeply he needed to prove he belonged in a world that had once overlooked him? He didn't know yet. But for the first time in a long while, Malcolm Raines began to feel something he hadn't expected: emptiness. There came a point, even for a man like Malcolm Raines, when the victories stopped feeling like victories. It had started quietly, an unease he couldn't name. At first, he chalked it up to exhaustion, the natural lull after conquering the airline industry. But as the weeks rolled on, the emptiness refused to fade. It crept in slowly, growing louder in the silences between meetings, in the stillness of late nights in his Eastbridge office. He had built something few could ever dream of. He had reshaped an entire industry. He had made a name that commanded headlines, fear, and respect. But now, surrounded by polished reports, glowing forecasts, and hand-picked executives, Malcolm found himself asking a question that had never occurred to him before. What was the point of all this? For years, power had been the goal. Winning, conquering, proving himself to a world that had once looked right through him. But in chasing those milestones, he had become something else, someone else. A man whose identity was tied not to vision or values, but to victory alone. And now, at the top of the mountain, he wasn't sure who he'd become. He poured himself another drink, the ice clinking softly in the glass, and leaned back in his leather chair. The skyline of Eastbridge stretched endlessly before him, blurred by the quiet drizzle streaking down the window. Had he changed for the better, or just hardened over time? He didn't have the answer. Not yet. What haunted him most wasn't the empire. It wasn't even Tessa, though her name still lingered like smoke from a fire long extinguished. It was the realization that he had lost something along the way. Clarity. He no longer remembered the exact moment when ambition turned into obsession. When a mission became a war. When winning became the only metric that mattered. All he knew was that it had happened. And now, he wasn't sure how to stop. The deals he used to chase with passion now felt transactional. The mergers and market plays that once thrilled him now blurred together into endless strategy sheets. He had spent a lifetime fighting, but now, for the first time, he wondered, was there still a fight worth having? He sat at his desk, the hum of the city below fading into white noise. The reports in front of him, earnings, growth metrics, expansion plans, might as well have been blank pages. His mind wandered to a simpler time, before Falconair, before Skybridge, before the headlines and corporate wars. Back when the vision had been clean, back when it had all meant something. He pushed the stack of papers aside and exhaled, long and slow. He had become the very kind of leader he once resented, the one who crushed rather than inspired, who operated through fear instead of vision. And while Tessa's downfall had once felt like poetic justice, now it felt empty. What had started as a response to a slight had become something far darker, a legacy built not just on success, but on elimination. He needed space, distance, a chance to breathe without the shadow of a brand or boardroom looming behind him. So, for the first time in his career, Malcolm Raines decided to take a break. Not forever, just long enough to step outside the machinery he had built. He had the luxury to do it. The business would run without him. His team could handle day-to-day decisions. The empire wouldn't crumble. And maybe, just maybe, stepping away would help him find what he had lost. He didn't make a public announcement, no press release, no interviews. Instead, he quietly booked a flight, not on Falconair, but on a private charter. His destination? A remote stretch of the Caribbean. A quiet island with no agenda, no boardroom, no reminders of his empire. There would be no meetings, no inbox, no whispers of mergers or media spins. Just sun, salt, sky, and silence. As he stepped off the jet and onto the white sands of Isla Ventana, the contrast hit him hard. There were no cameras, no flashing phones, no aides trailing behind him with schedules, just the sound of waves lapping gently at the shore. For the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to feel small, in the best possible way. He spent his days wandering the beach, swimming under open skies, and sitting in quiet cafes where no one knew who he was. He left his phone powered off, his laptop untouched. And slowly, the walls he had built began to crack. He read books, not about leadership or economics, but stories, memoirs, philosophy. He listened to old jazz records. He sat under palm trees and watched sunsets without once checking the time. It was disorienting at first, but slowly a sense of peace began to take root. He wasn't sure yet what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control everything. He was just being. And somewhere in that silence, Malcolm Raines began to remember who he used to be. Not the ruthless mogul, not the boardroom king, just a man chasing meaning. And maybe, just maybe, he would find it again. The waves of Isla Ventana had done what no boardroom could. They softened a man who had been made of stone for too long. As Malcolm Raines stepped off the island and returned to the towering glass corridors of Eastbridge, the air felt different, not heavier, lighter. Something had shifted inside him. He hadn't solved everything in that week of solitude. He hadn't meditated under a tree and found enlightenment. But he had realized this. The emptiness he felt had nothing to do with losing, and everything to do with forgetting why he started winning in the first place. Back in his corner office, overlooking the buzz of the city below, Malcolm didn't return to business as usual. He returned with a question. What would it look like to lead with purpose, not just power? He no longer wanted Falconair to be known only as a dominant force. He wanted it to stand for something greater, for innovation, for integrity, for people. And it would start with how he treated the very people who made the company fly. In the days that followed, Malcolm held private meetings with his senior leadership team, not to bark orders, but to listen. He asked them what had been lost during the rapid rise, what they feared, what they hoped to change. And they told him. Burnout, disconnection, employees afraid to speak up, good people leaving because they didn't feel seen, or worse, they felt disposable. It was a hard truth for a man like Malcolm to swallow, but he welcomed it. Because now, for the first time in years, he wasn't playing defense. He was building something better. He launched a new leadership initiative inside Falconair, the Horizon program, focused on mentorship, cross-department collaboration, and career development. Promotions wouldn't just go to the most aggressive. They'd go to those who lifted others up. He introduced wellness and mental health support for employees, reshaped flight crew scheduling to prevent burnout, and created space for feedback from all levels of the organization. And to the surprise of many, he began working closely with community partners in the cities Falconair served, investing in aviation scholarships, green initiatives, and sustainability programs that weren't just good for press, but good for people. The man who had once been feared began to be trusted, not by everyone, not at first, but the shift was real. "I don't recognize him," one executive whispered to another. "I do," someone else replied. "I think we're finally seeing the guy he used to be." But the change wasn't just in Malcolm's boardroom. It was in Malcolm himself. He started spending more time with his family, his sister, his niece, friends he hadn't seen in years. He reached out to old mentors, not to ask for advice, but to say thank you. He even volunteered for a local program helping underprivileged teens explore careers in aviation. Not because it would boost Falconair's image, because it felt right. He still carried that drive, that edge. The ambition that had built his empire hadn't disappeared, but it had matured. It was no longer about domination. It was about legacy. And as Falconair's stock continued to rise and customer satisfaction hit record highs, Malcolm didn't feel the old rush of conquest. He felt pride, not in owning something, but in growing it right. One afternoon, as he walked through the operations center, he passed by a new employee, a flight attendant fresh out of training. She smiled and greeted him with a mix of respect and nervousness. "You're Mr. Raines, right?" He nodded. "Malcolm's fine." She laughed shyly. "Sorry, it's just, I've heard the stories." He raised an eyebrow. "Good ones, I hope." "Some are intense," she admitted, then added quickly, "but people say you've changed everything here, that this is a place where we can actually grow." Malcolm paused for a moment. "Well," he said with a smile, "then we're on the right track." And as he walked away, he realized something he never would have admitted a year ago. That moment meant more than any press release ever could. Of course, the past still lingered. There were whispers of Tessa every now and then, her name surfacing like a ripple beneath calm waters. But Malcolm no longer flinched at the mention. He didn't see her as a threat anymore. He saw her for what she had become in his life, the spark that lit the fire. Had she wronged him? Yes. Had he gone too far in his retaliation? Absolutely. But without her, none of this change would have happened. His empire would have remained cold, unfeeling, powerful, but lifeless. Now it breathed. It had taken him years, millions of dollars, and the dismantling of another person's career to learn a truth he wished he'd understood sooner. The strongest leaders aren't remembered for what they conquer. They're remembered for what they build. As the months passed, Malcolm stood taller, not because he was feared, but because he was finally whole. He had answered the question that once kept him up at night. What comes next? The answer was simple: growth, with purpose. He had traded vengeance for vision, isolation for connection, control for contribution. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He had already won. But now he was learning how to lead. And as the sun set behind the East Bridge skyline, casting golden light across Falconair's logo high above the city, Malcolm Raines smiled to himself. He would never forget the woman who kicked him off that plane, not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because she had changed his life and through him helped change thousands more.